welcome to this very groovy episode of Austin-tober. Here I am on the set of Bond-tober to talk about the world's greatest British secret agent. That's right, it's not James Bond, it's Austin Danger Powers. Now, I'm not going to do that voice the whole time, but it's been a really tough year for Bond fans, and I think just the whole vibe of 2025 in general has been kind of wacky and a little bit oppressive. So I just thought, why not have a little fun with this? And so today we're going to talk about the first Austin Powers film, Austin Powers, International Man of Mystery.
Yeah, baby!
Following a successful stint on Saturday Night Live, as well as two very popular Wayne's World films, Mike Myers was really trying to get his career going in earnest in Hollywood. Now, that resulted in the cult hit So I Married an Axe Murderer and a couple of cameos and small bits here and there. One of his side projects was actually forming a quasi-mod band called Ming T. And Ming T had a couple of very good musicians in it, including Susanna Hoffs of the Bangles. And their whole shtick, the gestalt of the band, was to create characters that have 60s energy, 60s clothing, and 60s personas. Now, one of the brilliant things that Mike Myers did was he brought in his love of British culture, and especially culture of Britain in the 60s. Because when he was growing up, his mother and father absolutely loved things like that coming over, particularly the films of James Bond, In Like Flint, and all these British pop stars, the Beatles, and the like. Now, in the case of Mike Myers, he created a character known as Austin Powers, who wore crushed velvet suits, wore glasses just like Michael Caine, who we'll actually see in this series much later, and of course more and more evolved as they started touring and playing around with the characters, much like he would shape a character on Saturday Night Live. And one of the things was very specifics. He would speak in a very groovy fashion, and he would come up with these completely off-the-wall kind of sayings, like, "Oh, behave." And, of course, he would also emphasize with makeup. Like, one thing that I noticed on this latest rewatch that I did for this video was much is made about how bad Austin's teeth are. You know, it sort of plays into the stereotype that a lot of the Britons back in the 60s and 70s didn't really have that good dental hygiene, which is not true, in fact, but some just had bad teeth. And those specific sets of teeth that he uses are very much based on the pop idol Tommy Steele, who had a very notoriously wide, toothy, very British grin. So I genuinely wouldn't be surprised if Myers revealed that. And as they toured and as they hung out, the members of the band thought that Austin was particularly funny, including Mike Myers' wife, who encouraged him to start writing sketches or even possibly a film script centered around Austin, which he did think was a great idea. And one thing that really helped along with the development of the film was Susanna Hoffs' husband, to this day, is the film director Jay Roach, who would ultimately be the director for the whole Austin Powers franchise. So, honestly, it felt like Myers taking all of these things that he loved, and like I said, In Like Flint, Casino, even the parody of Casino Royale with the Burt Bacharach music, several sources throughout, you know, the mod colors, the psychedelic flowers, and, of course, the James Bond films were the primary blueprint for these films, as they are clearly parodies of the series. And you know, I learned this recently, again, during research and watching the film, but Mike Myers' father had passed away during the production of Wayne's World, or maybe shortly before Wayne's World was supposed to come out. And I'm sure those feelings of nostalgia and the things that he bonded with his father and his mother over, particularly the Bond films, I'm sure he was probably feeling very wistful about it, and he saw all these kind of crazy, absurd, even comic possibilities of the things that he would share with his dad. And so it almost feels like, more so than anything he did on Saturday Night Live or the films that would come later, it felt deeply personal to Myers. And I feel like that's why Austin is so appealing. is that he kind of gives that kind of 60s innocent mentality throughout the whole script. But if we're going to talk about a very famous secret agent and a very famous villain from the 1960s cryogenically freeze themselves to wake up at a time when peace and love no longer reign and greed and corruption ruled again, aka 1997, which, actually kind of sadly makes sense. So, of course, it doesn't feel like it was a weak story. It felt like Myers really sat down at the typewriter and said, I want to make a good story. I want to do some hilariously funny things. But he recognized after years of developing sketches at Saturday Night Live, which in and of themselves are mini stories, that you have to hit certain beats and you have to have certain things happen. Otherwise, it's almost soft comedy. It wouldn't quite work. There'd be a couple of chuckles here and there, but sadly, it wouldn't quite work. Now, we'll see this later on, even in the Austin-tober sequels, and definitely Myers' comedies post Austin Powers, but that's a story for another day. Now, what's kind of interesting is New Line Cinema picked up the script, and one of the producers, who I was very surprised years later when I realized, was Demi Moore. She and the Todds, and even Myers himself helped produce, which just told me all the more that this really felt like a true passion project. That Wayne's World was very much this is a Saturday Night Live movie vehicle, which they were still kind of trying to do at this time to give their stars careers. And in this case, this was one where it wasn't a Saturday Night Live film. This was very much a Mike Myers film, which was, as I said before, So I Married an Axe Murderer and a couple of films in between. They did okay. They weren't great comedies, but they did okay that Myers was able to keep his momentum going. And so when getting together with Jay Roach, they really hammered out the plot, the mechanics, as well as how to fit the comedy inside of the tropes and the general vibe that Myers and Roach really wanted to go for. And I think in this case, I'm going to get into the specific parody tropes later on, but I really do admire how strong this screenplay really is. I mean, it could have easily just been thrown together and Myers says, okay, let's shoot this. I think it's funny. He really put it together and said, no, I can back this up. This is a funny script. And of course, all the possibilities that they can make fun of both the 60s culture and the 90s too. The 90s don't get away with it unscathed. You just sit there and right from the very get-go, you have that brilliant tone setter of Austin dancing through the streets of London, leading the parade. He's a sex symbol and even mocking a Hard Day's Night, which is pretty funny. And it's all set to Quincy Jones's Soul Bossa Nova. It's such a shot in the arm.
You shot me right in the arm!
It really tells you what kind of movie you're in for. It's going to be a little absurd, it's going to be funny, it's going to be charming, and it's just going to be fun. And I know deep in my heart that when Myers picked that needle drop, he just thought, yeah, I've got this. It's just like, oh, behave, when they put it into the film. And of course, a hero's only as good as his villain. I think the best element of the Bond parody of this whole film, of everything, of this delicious layer cake is just the purest perfection on top is Dr. Evil.
$1 million.
Dr. Evil is what I call a laser-focused parody, in that it doesn't feel like a whole trope just kind of thrown together. It feels so specific and laser-focused on certain commonalities that all the Bond villains have, and even some villains from other spy films of the 60s, is that they're megalomaniacal. They want to not take over the world, which is, I think, what would happen with Roger Moore's film, which is clearly, I think, kind of the influence here. Sean and Roger. But it almost feels almost like a small threat, like they're a small enterprise, or rather, hilariously, Dr. Evil thinks this is a small, that this is a small criminal organization, whereas his number two man, nicknamed Number Two, played by Robert Wagner, has grown the company into a legitimate billion-dollar enterprise. Even owning a factory that makes miniature models of factories. That's very important. And them just having to explain to him, like, no, that's already happened. It's so funny. It's these little touches, and that kind of started the ball rolling on a huge point that I'm going to talk about much later after I talk about the rest of the film. But I just wanted to put a pin in that for right now. Now, when Austin wakes up, of course, he is very much a 60s man. He swaggers, he's kind of a little too groovy for his own good. And he does kind of have a schoolboy view of sex, which, of course, when he's paired with Vanessa Kensington, who's a brand new agent, clearly a woman of the 90s, you know that sparks are going to fly right away. In fact, his inner monologue lets us know that things are going to fly right away. But a great point about this is one of the great things about this script, and why I think this script is much better than people give it credit for, and also why I think it's better than the sequels, is you have a great character in Vanessa. You know, she starts out very, very tight, very controlled. Like I said, a woman of the 90s and wants to be an agent, and is all of a sudden saddled with this guy who her mother worked for back in the 60s. So that already feels like an intimate connection that she kind of doesn't want. You almost get the sense of that. But you also see that she's very firm with Austin, but never in a rude way. She understands, he's not of this time. He has to adjust, and I'll be there to help him. But she will call him out on his BS. You know, that scene on Austin's private jumbo jet, for example.
Do I make you horny, baby? Yeah, do I?
God, I hope this is part of the unfreezing process.
You know, it's like I said earlier, he has a schoolboy view of sex, which I think compared to the earlier Bonds, particularly Sean, where the sexuality feels much more aggressive and almost kind of in a sideways way, a little mean. Austin isn't exactly a hurtful character, and he's not mean about sex. Like, he won't force it. You know, it's almost like a schoolboy kind of discovered it. It's just like, oh, great, you know. And during the 60s, for men and women, it was almost like running through a field of flowers that haven't been picked. But again, because of Vanessa's strong characterization, he does start to kind of change his ways a little bit. He learns, like, oh, I'm not relevant anymore, nor are my views. So he almost, instead of Dr. Evil, who tries to kind of force things, which I'll get to in a second, Austin does genuinely try to understand the 90s and tries to get better, which is, I think, why the romance between him and Vanessa genuinely blossoms into something believable. And a lot of that also comes from the fact that Elizabeth Hurley is a really good actress. I think she's one of those rare actresses who can straddle impossible beauty with great intelligence and great maturity, which in this movie, of course, when the walls come down a little bit with her and Austin in the honeymoon suite in Vegas, after Austin does those bits with the behind the couch, you know, walking down the stairs, canoeing, it kills me every time I watch it. It's so good. But Vanessa is slightly tipsy, and she tries to get it on with Austin, but Austin surprises her and us by saying no, he won't do it because she's tipsy. It suggests that Austin does indeed have a moral code, which is another little layer that's peeled back from this character. So I think that's basically the strongest thing about the screenplay, and almost like that, what my screenwriter professor would use to describe is You need a coat rack to hang all these things on, otherwise the movie turns to spaghetti. It's no good. Or, in terms of comedy, it's going to be soft. There's going to be nothing. Now, as I was saying earlier, Dr. Evil is the opposite of Austin, clearly, because obviously he's evil. But another thing, too, is he can't adapt, really. And they hilariously and kind of randomly use the concept of him having a son cloned from his DNA, and it's Seth Green as Scott. You know, very much a teen of the 90s. He's got a punk attitude. Doesn't know, really, if he wants a relationship with Dr. Evil. And he's also the voice of Mike Myers during the scene where Austin and Vanessa get captured by Dr. Evil, and they're put into this easily escapable trap. And Scott says, "What? Aren't you going to watch them? They could get away." It's
Get away. I'm just... Knock, knock. Who's there?
which is played so wonderfully. It's so wonderfully awkward and kind of contradictory. Even that moment where in any other comedy, the parent would try to use a modern thing to connect with the teenager. You know, he does the ducka, 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 ducka. Huh? That's the day the Macarena died, I think, was when Dr. Evil did it. It was so perfect that it immediately became a relic of the 90s. Is that, again, laser-focused evisceration. Now, again, coming back to my point was there's another funny as hell scene where they're in therapy together, you know, father-son therapy. Carrie Fisher is the leader. I don't know why. But Scott actually tries to connect with Dr. Evil, and every time he does, like, what he wants to be in life and what he wants to do and who he is, Dr. Evil keeps saying, "Oh, would it be an evil petting zoo?" You know, that kind of thing. Like, he's trying to force his son to be what he's not, and he's only known him for like a week. It's amazing. And of course, Dr. Evil's portrayal by Myers, which was quite a reveal to audiences back in the 90s, because apparently, and looking back through the material, that wasn't quite publicized until the film came out. So it was a great surprise for the audiences. And I've heard a rumor that he wanted Jim Carrey to play Dr. Evil, which I don't know how I feel about that. I think it would have been funny. It would have been Jim Carrey at his peak, particularly in the 90s. But at the same time, I simply can't imagine anybody else playing Dr. Evil. Myers is just so hilariously bland and kind of cold that it's comedy nirvana every time he's on screen. You know, appearance-wise, it's the best parody of Bond because, you know, he wears the Nehru jacket, and originally he has a white cat, but then thanks to the bumbling Mustafa, played by Will Ferrell for some reason, you know, he turns into a hairless cat, Mr. Bigglesworth, which is one of the funniest pet names in the history of cinema. I just love it so much. And he has, you know, the bald head, and he has a little bit of the scar coming down his face, just like Ernst Stavro Blofeld does in You Only Live Twice. Donald Pleasance was clearly the physical model for it. So much so that I can't watch that movie, as you've seen in my review of You Only Live Twice. I just can't take him seriously because every time I see him, I see Dr. Evil.
I am Ernst Stavro Blofeld.
One thing I will discuss, which has sort of become the elephant in the room in recent years, at least on the internet, is Myers apparently based the voice for Dr. Evil on an impression Dana Carvey did of their old boss, Lorne Michaels. You know, Lorne Michaels, it's not exactly that exaggerated like it is here, but it's sort of, it's sort of kind of like that voice, that kind of thing. But obviously Dana Carvey probably had it down pat and exaggerated just to a slight degree where it became funny. And they definitely had a bit of a spat following the Wayne's World films, and particularly this didn't help. Now, fortunately, in recent years, they've made up, which, good on them. I love that they were pals, fell out a little bit, but then got back together. It's very sweet. And his cronies are amazing. I've already talked about number 2, but you also have Frau Farbissna, played by Mindy Sterling, who is clearly Rosa Klebb, same kind of haircut, same kind of makeup, that persimmon countenance that she has, who runs the militant wing of the Salvation Army, because of course she does. Why would she not? And again, next to Dr. Evil, the greatest Bond parody in the whole franchise, because we all should meet Random Task. Just random. It's such a basic joke, but it works. And of course, Random Task doesn't throw his hat like Oddjob. For parody reasons, he throws something else, which is his shoe.
Ow! That really hurt. Who throws a shoe? Honestly.
Yeah, Austin. I mean, it's something, all right. But they even have Patty O'Brien. They go on this little riff about his Lucky Charms, and I think I keep talking about the details of this is not only because the writing is detailed, but also that director Jay Roach brought an impressive eye for detail. It's almost like how Penelope Spheris directed the first Wayne's World, where there's great attention to detail about the props and the sets and the references, which I think was kind of key for this parody, is that it captured the vibe of the early Bonds of the 60s and all that, even of the 90s. Like Dr. Evil's underground lair is very Ken Adam-esque, the sharp angles, the clash between rock and chrome is very well represented, and that even translates into the Fembots attire, which is very kind of Mary Goodnight like covering and kind of the chrome. You also get some fun things in terms of how they also photograph, because a lot of the old Bonds tended to be a little rough around the edges, but still have a very cinematic feel. This one also does, because it had a fair budget, but compared to the sequels, it's a very small one. So it does kind of have that little homespun, rough around the edge kind of quality. But it also lends for some really creative cinematography and some creative jokes. The electric cart getting stuck in the tunnel after Austin and Vanessa escape from the mutated sea bass.
Right.
Austin says he's going to go right back to Dr. Evil. Just can't do it. And it cuts away. And it comes back. It's a close-up on Austin. He's going back and forth. Slow zoom out reveals the cart is so stuck in the tunnel. It's amazing. I howl every time I see it, just because of how beautiful that reveal is, along with Myers genuinely trying to figure this out, genuinely trying to steer this thing out of the way. It also made for my favorite joke during that Suez crisis a couple of years ago when the tanker got stuck. Like, I love how they play with composition in this movie. I think Jay Roach is a very good comedy shooter. Much like Chris Columbus and a couple of other great directors. They're very good at knowing how to shoot a joke, whereas it doesn't feel intrusive to the comedy, but it doesn't feel like it was kind of thrown together like, oh, all we want is the joke on screen. They make it feel part of this world and very cinematic. Like, one of my favorite sight gags of the film, which sums up kind of the absurdist humor of some of this. Like, there's some times in the original James Bond film where the characters could have easily gotten out of the way, or they could have easily been saved had they not made certain decisions. There's a joke where Austin and Vanessa steal a steamroller, and one guard just goes, "No!" And he holds that for a long time. It cuts to a wide of the guard is here, and the steamroller's very slowly, and he won't move. It's so delightfully bizarre. It's just those little touches of how you can use cinematography to elevate a joke and how to elevate what you're parodying. Because it does, like I said, along with the sets and the costumes and things, it does really capture that general vibe. I love that Roach, it really feels like Roach and Myers deeply care about how this film looks and how it's carried off, because I feel like they subscribe to the school of good comedy, which is the more believable a character and a setting is, the funnier the jokes will seem, because A, they'll either feel out of place, which draws attention and could be very funny, or it's always like, oh, yes, of course it works like that. You know, there's a whole thing about, there's a whole little bit that's a parody of like Q Branch, where Austin's getting his crushed velvet suit and his Italian boots and things like that back. And there's a certain item which I don't think YouTube will really allow me to describe, but they go on a huge riff about having the credit card receipt and the warranty and the novel of Austin's escapades with it, which always just gets such a chuckle out of me, is that while he was saving the world, he had time to write a book about this very specific item. Again, it's so hysterically portrayed by the clerk, who was one of Mike Myers' old comedy partners in Canada, which I thought was kind of nice, kind of a little bit of career continuity. Even Michael York, who brilliantly parodies M as probably the greatest parody name, or one of the greatest parody names and parody tropes in history.
I'm Basil Exposition with British Intelligence.
He delivers that with such conviction that it kills me every time I hear it. And even that little message incoming, that little melody is, I wanted to have that as my ringtone at one point, but I couldn't quite get it. Now, of course, also something about the setting which I think I should talk about, because I kind of trashed Las Vegas in my Diamonds Are Forever review, because I thought for James Bond it felt sort of like a tacky environment, and it didn't lend a much cinematic quality, because most of it was shot during the day, whereas Vegas only comes out at night. But also it was photographed the wrong way, so it looked more chintzy than kind of appealing. But what I like here is that it matches the 60s aesthetic. When you go to Swinging London in the opening scene, and Austin and Vanessa go to the Psychedelic Pussycat Swingers Club, it's surrounded by all these neon signs, and it's got these mod colors, kind of the Warhol-esque quality. And I think they found that match in Las Vegas a little bit, because you also see a lot of the neons, and a lot of it doesn't feel forced. Now, if I was to criticize this film for something, is that unfortunately Myers does give in to some forced humor. And what I mean by that is there's two things that he favors compared to other types of comedy. One is he loves to run a joke into the ground, and sometimes he doesn't quite know when to pull back from it. Like, there's almost this kind of shtick where a comedian will run a joke into the ground, but if he repeats it enough times or kind of calls attention to it, sometimes it bounces back and it's funny. Like I love when Austin and Vanessa are in that easily escapable trap that Dr. Evil will just close the doors and pretend and assume everything went according to plan. What? That, the guard gets taken out and Austin makes some head puns, you know, that part is funny because the second or third joke, it's like, okay, that's not really that good. But then the fourth joke, it's really funny. It comes back around. But sometimes that doesn't really happen in this film. And another thing too is Myers, a lot of comedians did this in the 90s, and it kind of led to a resurgence of gross out humor in films. I think that was more or less started by Dumb and Dumber, which is a very funny movie, but I think sadly kind of got exploited. And, there's one scene in the men's room where Patty O'Brien tries to take out Austin, and because of the angle from the guy in the next stall, who is Tom Arnold in a role where he's actually funny, Make-A-Wish, his reaction ultimately saves it. But then there's other scenes later on, like the hot tub scene where he makes one decent joke where it gets a good chuckle, but then he makes a couple more and you say, oh man, Mike, you had it. You had it. Don't do that.
You just don't get it, do you? You don't.
Those are really my only criticisms with it. And I think that does go to show how strong this movie is. So much so that when the film came out, I'll talk a little bit about the release and how it kind of became popular first, because it's going to tie into my theme for why this is here in Bondtober to begin with. So the film was released to pretty good reviews, not the most glowing reviews, but Siskel and Ebert enjoyed the film, and a couple other critics thought it was a delightful, charming, and fresh film. And they appreciated the parody references, they appreciated the fish out of water narrative. Some just thought, oh, okay, well, this is a fine movie, nothing to write home about, which was kind of strange. But the film itself only did modest success at the box office. But like a lot of popular films of our generation, it was saved immensely by home video. When it was released to video rental stores and in retail, that's when the sales really went up for it, because there were people who would say, oh, did you ever see Austin Powers? And they say, oh no, what's that? Oh, well, go rent it or go pick it up. And a lot more people would pop it in and they say, hey, that was really fun. Or some people fell in love with it, head over heels. They thought, oh, this is great. This is one of the best James Bond parodies, if not the best James Bond parody. And it kind of got passed around, especially amongst the younger demographic and the teen demographic. They would rent it. I feel like a lot of older brothers would show their younger brother this movie, almost not quite as a rite of passage, but almost just like, hey, this is a funny movie. Why don't you watch it? And there's nothing inherently inappropriate in there for young kids. It almost feels like an old PG movie where, yeah, kids could watch it, but you better have your parent there to kind of like, block your eyes or say, I'll leave the room for a minute, but come back in like 30 seconds. And that's kind of how the whole gestalt of Austin Powers grew. It was kind of a cult hit, which once that started happening, ultimately led to the development of the sequel, which is, of course, Austin Powers, The Spy Who Shagged Me, which I'm going to get into next year. And I do have some notes. I do have some thoughts about that movie. So just giving you a year to kind of brace yourself for that. Now, the reason why I wanted to do Austin-tober this year was because of the news of the Broccolis leaving. And this series really did have a very profound effect on the Bond franchise, particularly on the producers and the actors and the crew. Because, first of all, many of them expressed admiration for it. A lot of them said, oh my God, these are so funny. They're very entertaining, they're funny, and they're very clever and observant, making fun of us. Now, the downside to that is when they would sit down to write a new Bond film, really when Spy Who Shagged Me came out, and even when Goldmember came out later, is it's so laser focused on specific threads and specific character things and specific tropes of the stories of James Bond, the whole saga up to that point. And mind you, GoldenEye had only come out 2 years before, and Austin came out before Tomorrow Never Dies would come out in December of 97. So Bond had only just re-entered the consciousness again. And of course, people still loved a lot of the classic Bond films. But once they started watching this film and other parodies of it, they started to say, oh yeah, Bond kind of does that a lot, doesn't he? You know, they do rely on these tropes a lot. And it's almost, it's not as lethal as what Scream did to the horror genre. I just want to put that out there. Scream was like a blowtorch to the genre, whereas this was kind of like a feather tickling the side of the spy genre. You know, where it's a loving parody. You know, it's not aggressive. It doesn't put down the Bond films. It clearly has great reverence for it, but they are going to have a little fun at its expense. Barbara Broccoli and Michael Wilson have been on record saying that they very much enjoy the Austin Powers films. They find them very funny. But when they sat down to develop the new ones, there were some things where they'd start writing and developing and say, oh, we could do this, we could do this. Oh, actually, we can't do that anymore, can we? Because Austin Powers kind of called us out on it. So it more or less forced them to think outside the box, which ultimately culminated, unfortunately, in Die Another Day, where they decided to double down and sort of call it the tribute 40th anniversary film. But unfortunately, it was full of the things that Austin Powers made fun of, which is, I think, why fans more or less turned on Die Another Day. So when it came to Casino Royale, they really had to think, okay, Austin kind of forced our hand here, so now we have to really do a hard reboot, which resulted in Casino Royale. The fact that a good parody, can have a seismic impact on the genre it's making fun of or sending up. I think back to what Airplane did for the disaster film, or what Blazing Saddles did to the Western. It forced a reckoning after so many years of taking what were once fresh cliches and fresh stories and kind of doing them to death, that it forced a reckoning to say, oh, how do we change moving forward? And I think that's what Austin kind of did. I'll give you this. I think The Spy Who Shagged Me might have had more of an impact in terms of box office and appeal to the mass market. But International Man of Mystery was kind of that seismic film where the genre was more or less turned on its ear, but more, like I said, it wasn't aggressive. It was more of a, hey, listen to the ground a little bit. This is what people think. And when they hear that, they're like, oh, we should change. So that's why I wanted to save this for last was, yes, this is indeed, I think, the best James Bond parody that we've ever seen. And it'll never change for me. But I think now that Barbara and Michael are out, we're kind of looking at that critical time when they took over the franchise, that it hit kind of in the right spot where Barbara and Michael were trying to do some new things, but still retain some of the old DNA. Now, I think Austin also kind of helped them realize, okay, what part of the DNA can we keep and should we keep? Whereas the others, they said, oh, well, we don't need that anymore. Don't need that, don't need that, don't need that. You know, that kind of thing. It was, it's almost like what Austin said to Dr. Evil after Dr. Evil calls out his own values, which he says people of this decade would call evil. Austin says, that great line, he says, no, if we knew the consequences of our actions, we would have done it differently, because now we have freedom and responsibility. It's a very groovy time. It's smart comedy informing people, and even people in Hollywood like, oh yeah, that's kind of what this movie is. That's what this is about. So, and one thing I will say is, I feel like I'm gushing about this film is because I did grow up with this film. I actually didn't see the sequels until I was well into high school, if you could believe it. I knew that they were out there. It wasn't like I was ignorant of them. But this was one of those films where you almost have that feeling of, I know the sequels are out there, but I kind of don't want to see them. Because this film just kind of feels a little special. And like I said, we'll get to the sequels as the next seasons come. But honestly, this movie is a comedy that will stand the test of time. It's very funny, it's very intelligent, and it's very observant. And it really genuinely wouldn't have had the legs that it has if it didn't. If it was like The Spy Who Shagged Me, which has some funny jokes, but is kind of a spaghetti in terms of its plot. This one feels like a nice little treat. You might get a kick out of it, and you may even come to love it. And even if you don't, that's okay. There are very specific things in here which the viewer A, may not get, or B, they probably won't care. But if you're in the Bond know like I am, or like all of us are, you get a little bit of an extra kick out of it. So, in conclusion, Austin Powers' International Man of Mystery is a most shagadelic motion picture that you should all check out if you can. Just wonderful little bits like that. So, thanks for joining me this year for Bond-tober. And for Austin-tober, I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I hope to see you next year. I'm Jim Crowley.